welcome everyone on this bright sunny day. We're just out for the last of our faculty academic staff forum series talks of this spring 2024 semester. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Kristine Knutson. She is the professor and chair of the Department of Communication and Journalism. And before I turn things over to Chris, I just want to first say a word or a couple of words of thanks to our collaborators for this program. CEDL, who obviously offers their space to us, and technology support, and also Learning and Technology Services, who make it possible for us to be able to stream and record these talks. So thank you to those other organizations that make it possible for us to do this. And then I also want to remind everyone that we will have time after the talk for questions. So be thinking about the things that you'd like to ask. And for our online viewers, we'll ask you to use either the chat or Q&A button at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're on, but we'd like to hear from you as well. Our graduate assistant, Matt, will read your questions aloud for us. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Knutson.
Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to talk to you about an in-progress research project that me and a group of undergraduate students are working on. I hope to continue and move forward with this project with additional undergraduate students moving forward. So yeah, the title of the talk is Problematizing Professional. And so to kind of get started, I'll explain where we get to that, but I want to talk a little bit about our agenda for the day. So I'm going to start by talking about what the origins of this project were, talk a little bit about a concept called communication competence, talk about neurodivergence, help us understand better what the word professional means, and then present you with some initial findings from a class project that the research students have been working on this semester, and then also talk about some future directions for our project. So the origins for the project are my son. So this is Connor, and Connor is 8 years old, and Connor is neurodivergent. And so as I have parented Connor and investigated what it takes to raise a neurodivergent child, communicate with a neurodivergent child, understand how he experiences the world, going through that process to try and learn that information to help raise my child and help raise my child well, I've come to realize that lots of the things we teach in the communication classroom are really, really problematic. And so I found myself really having difficulty teaching some of the foundational concepts in courses, because all of a sudden we're talking about concepts and constructs that are not easy for neurodivergent individuals to perform. And so by continuing to reiterate that these are the right ways to do things and teaching people this is proper communication, what we're doing is consistently building this space where we are labeling neurodivergent communicators or some neurodivergent communicators as incompetent. And so really the impetus for this project came from what I had learned through the process of raising my child. Now, I would love to say that, oh my goodness, I knew all of this before, right? And so there's a level of shame attached to the fact that it took raising my neurodivergent child for me to recognize, oh, these things I've been teaching for 13 years are kind of problematic. However, it is a nice moment in time to take that step back and say, how do we challenge some of these ideas? How do we challenge these norms in meaningful ways? All right. So the key concept that I struggle with, and we're going to talk about today, is communication competence. So communication competence is at the center of a lot of the communication courses that we teach to introductory level students. And so communication competence is the idea that communication is a competent communicator is someone who can communicate in a way that is effective and appropriate for a given situation, in which communicators continually evaluate and reassess their own communication processes. And so central to this notion of what it means to be competent is that your communication needs to be effective and it needs to be appropriate. So when we break these two terms down, effectiveness is really going to be whether or not, or we measure that in the communication discipline by whether or not your communication achieves your goals So if my goal is to get my partner to go to X restaurant for dinner, I am effective when we go to the restaurant I want to go to, right? Like when we have achieved our goals through the communication choices that we make, we label that communication as effective. The more problematic of the competence terms is the appropriate term, because when we talk about appropriate, here we define appropriate communication as communication that meets the demands of the situation as well as the expectations of other people present. And so it's getting to the expectations of others where we really find the places and spaces where this concept can limit the ways that we view neurodivergent individuals. So if in a job interview, we are teaching people that they have to make constant eye contact, and just from the crowd, what are lessons that we know about people who don't make good eye contact? Well, they could be autistic, but what is probably the more colloquial lesson that we would learn from people who would shy away from eye contact? They're hiding, they're lying, that's all right. So, right? So the argument would be, often we teach that that's a sign of lying. So if people are fearful of making eye contact with you, that means they're lying. So if you think about that in the context of a job interview, a person who's uncomfortable making eye contact and isn't making eye contact with a job interviewer, we've kind of trained people to perceive that to be like you're hiding something, you're falsifying information. And so that can become a barrier to getting a job, that can become a barrier to progressing in a career, right? So this appropriate term gets very difficult for us because the expectations of others are based upon what is neurotypical. It's based very frequently on what is white, right? What are the privileged identities within a society? And then communication norms of those groups are going to be what determines appropriateness for a group of people. So just to introduce people in the room who are not necessarily familiar with the communication studies field, where do we see communication competence taught in the communication studies curriculum? Well, we see it in public speaking. So in public speaking, we're going to teach students how to deliver oral messages. To do that, we teach all sorts of things like, distracting hand gestures, right, can be difficult for people to process. We talk about how if you're not fluid in your speech, people are going to think that you're unprepared. We also teach the importance of eye contact. Eye contact will consistently come up, the importance of eye contact. And if you can't make meaningful eye contact with every member of your audience, that's going to be a place or a space where your audience might perceive you to be lying, unethical, not a competent, or not competent, but also not a credible speaker. Right? We tie this into this notion of how believable and how credible is that speaker. In interpersonal communication, in that course, we teach students lessons about how to build and foster relationships with people. And so we're talking about how do you initiate, continue, and dissolve friendships, dating relationships, how does that operate within family relationships? And so again, within all of those contexts, we get to our chapter on nonverbal and we explain to people, I'll keep coming back to eye contact, but eye contact is essential. This is where you hear and learn all about how a lack of eye contact is connected with lying, right? And you find out that in the interpersonal communication class. In professional communication, we teach people how to apply for jobs and how to present themselves within business contexts in competent ways. The primary textbooks for professional communication classes are all competence-based. And so we talk about what does it mean to be competent, and same thing in organizational communication. How do we foster meaningful organizational relationships between superiors and subordinates? And again, if we're not talking about neurodivergent ways of being, if we're not talking about ways of being that are outside of what's considered the norm, we are setting up situations where individuals who become leaders in organizations don't pay attention to different ways of being and don't become accepting of different ways of communicating. All right. So what then is neurodivergent or neurodivergence? Neurodivergence simply means that we have a brain that works differently from the average or neurotypical person. This might highlight differences in like social preferences, ways of learning, ways of communicating, or ways of perceiving your environment. So neurodivergent brains are brains that just work differently than other people's brains. When norms that underpin what is acceptable, though, in terms of communication, are communication patterns that are easier for neurotypical people to perform, we leave neurodivergent individuals in a space where they're perceived as incompetent or unprofessional, to get back to what our title is, not because there's actually a problem with how they're communicating or what they're doing, but because the people in the room with more power are perceiving it to be problematic. Here is by no means a list of neurodivergent conditions. And so we have conditions like dyslexia, ADHD, Tourette syndrome. People can acquire neurodivergence if you think of, perhaps athletes who have had concussions, right? That might alter the way a brain functions. That would be an acquired neurodivergent. Learning disabilities, individuals with mental health differences can have, or would be neurodivergent. Autistic individuals, people with dyspraxia, dyscalculia, etc. So in all of these instances, this is, like I said, just a small number of people who are neurodivergent. This is a short list. It's hard to find a all-encompassing list of what we would consider to be neurodivergent conditions. And just to be a tiny bit picky, because you'll see this a lot, the middle of the graphic says neurodiversity. It's neurodivergent. And so you'll see that a lot too. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on this one, but if we had a whole bunch of people in the room who were all autistic, there would not be neurodiversity in that room because everyone in that room would be autistic, right? But there would be neurodivergent people in that room. So just a silly word choice. I don't know why. It's one that we mess up a lot, where we talk about like neurodiverse people when we mean neurodivergent, and we talk about neurodiversity when we mean neurodivergence. So then what is our problem with communication competence? Well, in 2023, the editors of Communication Education, Communication Journal posed the question, how have we as communication scholars hurt and helped ourselves? And to advocate for and demonstrate the value of our scholarship, what are new questions that need to be asked, and how do we go about answering them? So after this call, there is a lovely essay published by Young and Bernays, and they talk about communication competence as being this highly problematic term that underpins like basic education, or what foundational education in the entire communication discipline. So if you will indulge my quote, and I will put it up here in case others want to read it. This is not surprising, as communication effectiveness has long been defined by competencies. However, competencies within the foundational course have been operationalized for assessment under ideological structures that value certain competencies and marginalize those unable to perform them. Spitzberg argues that this puts communication instructors and scholars in a conundrum. By constructing competencies as those skills that lead to success in hegemonic cultures, individuals may idealize and reinforce many problematic practices. One such practice is judging the effectiveness of the presentation by the speaker's ability to stand and move, give eye contact, and modulate their voice. When there is little accommodation for the speaker's standpoint, another practice is whether the speaker is motivated to communicate effectively by traditional standards. Within the communication field, there is a group of communication scholars dedicated to transforming the way we do things. And I recall one day in like group chats, they were talking about assessing speeches for a student who, a non-speaking student. And so a non-speaking student is going to use a device to speak. And so that was one of the big concerns, is how do I assess that when they can plan out their whole speech and then just walk up to the front of the room and hit a button, right? And it became this big point of, I'm enjoying some of the facial expressions to that, became this big point of concern with how do we grade that when they're not being asked to do that live, and they're not being asked to modulate their voice, have tone and inflection, because you can't really get tone and inflection when you're talking through a device, right? And so there's lots of good education that happened within that sphere and within that space as well. But again, it's this conundrum that when we center these ideas, even the act of how do I grade a speech becomes problematic. All right. Additionally, in a 2020 article published in the Review of Communication, Kristen Cole talks about how we can neuroqueer interpersonal communication as a foundational course. to unsettle the dominant assumptions that undergird some of our discipline's foundational interpersonal communication theories. And so by doing this, we can highlight the ways that we've set up unjust power dimensions and to exclude individuals who are neurodivergent and allow us to take a more critical pedagogy to looking at understanding neurodivergence. So really quickly, I wanted to give you all the opportunity to see an autistic individual explain to us why eye contact is so difficult. Just again, I can say autistic people, and again, that's not going to be the single experience for all autistic individuals as well. I can say that that would be something that autistic individuals might struggle with, but I wanted you to hear from an autistic individual as well as to why, rather than just accepting that as a truism. So we've now discussed what the problem with communication competence as a construct is. We've talked a little bit about how that construct is limiting to neurodivergent individuals. The next major part of this particular study is trying to understand what this notion of professional means. And so at this point, if we can get some group interaction, I put a Post-it on the middle of the table. And so if everyone could grab a Post-it, and can you define for me what it means to be professional? You could write a definition. You could write a bunch of words that were signifiers of what it means to be professional. You could draw a picture of someone acting professional, right? Can I have a volunteer? Tell me their definition or what they wrote or drew. Okay, so professionals follow an ethical code provided by their professional organization. Other thoughts? Yeah, okay, they're respectful of their colleagues. Okay.
Being paid.
Right. Yep.
One of them is what I think professional is, and that's completing work to expectations and comfortable clothing that reflects your gender identity.
Yep.
But when I think of the media I grew up with, a lot of it was people who are showered white, coat with no AAP, they makeup on, their shade if they were women. They didn't sweat because they took a car to work and they didn't bike or walk.
Yep. Well done. Absolutely. Absolutely. Other thoughts people have? Yeah.
When I think about professional, I think about a sort of a schema of performative cues to succeed, whatever success means, to succeed or pass in business and organizational context that's usually culturally normative. Yep.
So what are some of those?
Well, for the most part.
In U.S. American culture, in
U.S. American culture, a lot of these are based upon some of the communication competence and hygiene.
Yep. So again, we have to be showered and shaved. There was a lot of discussion in with the research team about critiques of color of hair. And so even I was surprised to learn this. At Woodman's, you can't have a not natural hair color. Find this very surprising at Woodman's. Yeah, right. Like Woodman's does not seem like the space where you would expect a professional standard that would say you must have a natural. I know, right? Because it's a grocery store and you're going to be hiring young people. I mean, young people who are very frequently playing with who they are, right? Playing with hair color, things like that as a completely acceptable. So yes, Woodman's does not allow you to have your hair an unnatural color. Piercings are another, and piercings, tattoos, they talked a lot about those needs to have those covered up. So again, when we talk about our understandings colloquially of what is professional, all of these little things factor in, right? And so when we were, as a research team, looking for a definition of professional, is very hard to find because it is very culturally based and it is always like situated within a particular moment in time and within particular people. So the downside of that is that dominant cultural norms reinforce what it means to be professional and we hold people to that standard. The upside of that is when we collectively agree to what cultural norms are, there are places and spaces for those norms to change, right? And so that's one of the aims of the project is how do we walk away with what we've learned and help to inform organizations, help to inform universities, different constituencies in the field of communication in general. How do we inform those entities to kind of help expand what that meaning of competence means, so we can hopefully help to change what is perceived as normative behavior, what is perceived as acceptable, if communication competence stays as what is effective and appropriate. How do we expand what is appropriate? All right, so the definition for professional that we found is communication that is courteous, conscientious, and generally businesslike in manner. Now, again, I don't know what in businesslike or businesslike in manner means, but Lucas and Rollins tell us that is what communication, professional communication looks like. They have written textbooks that are used in professional communication classes to outline how to perform professionalism. Likewise, they tell us that professional communicators are careful, courteous, and follow conventions. So again, within that instance, we are consistently reiterating that the norm for the field is what we are expected to produce and reproduce. So in terms of the research project, what we've seen thus far is part of an extensive literature review, or tiny portions of what was an extensive literature review that I completed past summer with Brandy McQueen, who is a student researcher. This semester, we're doing an in-class pilot. And so Brandy and a team of additional researchers, Abby Bratton, Alfred Daniel, Katie Kleinman-Lee, and Sam Terry, have been working just to hold informal conversations with individuals in their peer group who identify as neurodivergent. And then the goal there is to help us understand what we are looking at and what we are excluding from the questions that we ask, so that we can hold more formal interviews next spring and prepare for those in the fall with neurodivergent adults. And I will explain why we made that shift as we talk about our initial findings. So the vast majority of young people they spoke to talked about three primary things. That is that professional attire is a sensory nightmare, time blindness is a challenge, and being direct isn't being rude. And so the vast majority of comments that we heard from right? And I would concur with all of those things, but the vast majority of comments centered on these ideas. And so we'll investigate what each of these are a tiny bit more, and then I'll talk about where that becomes limiting to the suggestions that we can make to the field as a whole. So professional attire is a sensory nightmare. So a lot of neurodivergent individuals have sensory I don't want to say issues, but sensory differences that are going to make being in dress clothes uncomfortable. There's a autistic advocate online, Diary of a Mom, and she talks about her daughter's experiences. Her daughter is 21 right now, worked at Uno, which was her favorite restaurant to go to. And so it was a whole big thing as they were trying to pick the place where she wanted to work, that she really wanted to go to Uno. She loved her job. And then one day was just like, I'm done working there. And so it was really sad for the mom, because we're like, we've worked to do this. Let's try and figure out why you want to quit today, because it was like, we must quit. And the answer was, I'm required to wear jeans to work, and the jeans aren't comfortable, right? And so the point of this, when this advocate was telling that story, the point of that story is, of course, like, we got leggings that look like jeans, and she got to keep her job because you can wear leggings that look like jeans, and that is not problematic. But in that particular context, when people who are working with her don't investigate the reason for quitting, and it's just, I would like to quit and we're going to move forward, we might move past the job that we very much so enjoyed in a place where we liked what we were doing, simply because the jeans were uncomfortable, right? And so this is a place or a space where multiple students as well that they talked to, I talked about the difficulty with uniform standards and being told that they're not professional because they're not meeting uniform standards when those uniforms are uncomfortable. So in particular places, perhaps uniforms are essential. So if you think scrubs in a hospital setting might be essential, right? We can perhaps find different fabrics that we could make scrubs in. There's different ways we can advocate there. But for the vast majority of jobs that we do, the attire probably doesn't matter so much with what we're doing. Like, we've seen this after COVID, as people have come back to work. People have come back to work in much more casual clothing, than they once were expected to wear. And so hopefully that is a start of a new trend that becomes more inclusive by allowing people to express themselves at work in clothing different than the charcoal suit with the solid colored button up top, right? A second finding a lot of people talked about was time blindness. So time blindness is very frequently associated with neurodivergent individuals, particularly individuals with ADHD. And time blindness is this idea that like you can start a task, and as you become involved in the task, the processing of time kind of goes away. And so all of a sudden you're in the task, you're doing the task, you're achieving the task, but like 2 hours has passed and you were supposed to start getting ready for work an hour, like after an hour and a half, right? And so then you're always rushing, always late. So lots of good conversations came within the conversations about time blindness, because perhaps there are some jobs where timeliness matter a lot, right? Like if you're going to be a cashier and you're scheduled for the 8 a.m. opening shift and you're the only cashier on, if you're a half an hour late to work, that's probably problematic. But there's lots of times and places where timeliness and being there at a particular time are not necessary. And so a lot of students were talking about situations where being there at a specific time was not an issue, but they were overly critiqued by supervisors for being late. So getting deductions on their annual reviews because they were late to work because everyone arrives at 8 and you get in around 8:15 every day. But if I don't have a meeting with anyone that I'm supposed to be meeting with till 9 and I stay 15 minutes late to make up the time, what does it matter? A really good question, because it probably doesn't matter. And the last one that a lot of students talked about was being critiqued for the way that they speak. And so speaking in a more direct tone and having that be perceived as really negative and really rude. And so there is no intentionality in that communication of rudeness. But again, when people are not trained to understand or be able to understand other people's lived experiences and understand how to conceptualize that information, there's difficulty in interpreting those messages. So, and then they're interpreted as rude, and again, that negatively affects a person's progress through an organization. All right. So those were the key findings. I think the space where we struggled and we've thought about how do we move forward with this is the information that we were getting is all very germane to people who are in hourly positions. And so not that there shouldn't be advocacy done for people in hourly positions, but I think some of the stronger critiques that people talk about in terms of professionalism come when people move into jobs that are past those service industry jobs, right? And so limiting right now discussions to just student participants has become difficult because of just a lack of work experience. And so as we're really talking about how do we advocate for wider descriptions of what it means to be professional, we need to expand who that audience is and talk to adults with who identify as neurodivergent. All right, and that is what I have. Okay, so the question is talking about if we're talking about communication competence and effectiveness and appropriateness and how that might look for different for neurodivergent individuals, how is that different from a communication disorder?
Yeah.
Some of that is semantic. And so I'm just making a choice to not call them communication disorders when people in the past would have called them communication disorders. And so some of that is just the perspective. If you're coming at it from a neurodiversity perspective, you're approaching the research in a way to say this isn't disordered, it's just different. And so if we take the term disorder off, we're not working through the ways that we pathologize it to say it's bad, because it's not bad, it's simply different. And it's that pathologizing of different ways of being that put us in situations where we see those particular behaviors as bad or we see those behaviors as negative. So the question was, when we're working with neurodivergent groups, what are strategies for the people who are working with those groups to help ensure that communication is happening, like when we need to? Generally speaking, we hear a lot of like, are our listening ears on? versus like eyes at the front. So a lot of times teachers will talk about like eyes on me, eyes at the front. And a lot of it is just a shift to the listening. Like, let's make sure our listening ears are turned on, and then accepting that the individuals in the room are turning their listening ears on because you've asked them to, right? And so that is a lot of it is just reminding yourself in your mind, it's switching over. And boy, are you correct when you say that's difficult. Like, that was one of the ones with my son that took the longest, was like the look at me and being okay with not looking at me. And for me, the very helpful way to do that was always listen to me. And then you take a pause because you want to give people time to turn their listening ears on, but listen to me, and then you give the direction. And you can do follow-ups after that too, right? Like, does everybody understand? Right? Or raise your hand if you understand, or raise your hand if you have questions, or yeah, whatever the group norm for how one would communicate that, like as the larger group. Yes, there will be a sign up for the adult portion of the study. If I can grab the name, I can make sure to reach out to them and I'll grab the name from you before we go. I will make sure to reach out when we get to that portion. And the only criteria is that you've worked in a professional setting and you identify as neurodivergent. And it would not be an official diagnosis. So that's a whole other, are you going to ask? No, okay. That's a whole other thing, and we will. The medical, I'll very quickly, and then I'll go to Lily. The medical establishment makes it very difficult for adults to get diagnoses. And so many adults who identify as neurodivergent are self-diagnosed. So that is not a problem. We're not going to ask for official documentation because self-diagnosis is appropriate. It's relatively new research. So a lot of the early research, like the oldest pieces we are finding, are from 2020. Relatively new research. There was a big moment in the communication discipline a couple years back where it was the communication is so white movement that happened. Yeah. And it happened within our national conference, and it like that spurred the creation of like groups of communication scholars who are interested in transforming the discipline. And it's through a lot of those discussions that we're now connecting like with disability studies to get there. So, oh my goodness, I have way too much work to do. But someday what would be nice would be doing like creating that professional communication textbook that centers, right? That centers neurodiversity and centers or just social justice and inclusion. It doesn't have to only be neurodivergent voices in there, but like, how do we challenge some of these ideas, and presenting that in a textbook so that then as instructors are trying to talk about professional communication, they have other options to pull from that allow them to get that type of information. And then you publish it as an open access textbook. And then right? And then everyone can access that. So I think that is where a lot of the discipline is going. So there is an open access interpersonal textbook that now that's kind of working to break down some of those expectations. So my presumption is in the years to come, we're going to see a lot more of those books come out, which again, hopefully then are picked up by instructors who say, yes, I've always had a problem with this, and utilize them in the classroom and gradually work to make some of that change. The difficult part, I'll say, as an instructor is how do you balance that, right? Because I teach professional communication. And so we spend lots of time being like, and this is super problematic, and this is why this is awful, and I would like you to get a job. So I'm going to tell you that right now they're going to expect you to do this. And they shouldn't, and that's wrong. But if I don't tell you they're going to expect you to do that, you don't get into the organization to be the leader in the organization someday to not expect people to do that, right? And so there is that challenge there that you can be training lots of people to recognize where we should be going, but if the world isn't there yet.